At his own dinner table, his son's fiancée smirked and called him an ugly old fool in French, bragging she would marry only for a green card and his inheritance. She believed the old man was deaf to her venom, not knowing his late wife had taught him every word. He kept his face calm, even warm, as he handed her the bread, but inside he sharpened a blade of silence that would cut deeper than any shout. Subscribe now and comment where you're watching from, because the trap he set that night would shake their world to pieces. The study smelled faintly of old leather and dust, a perfume only a man who had lived too long among books could ever find comforting. Thomas Miller sat at his desk, the worn oak marked with decades of ink stains, his hand brushing absent-mindedly across the spines of volumes that had outlasted entire generations of students. Boston hummed faintly outside, but within these walls time had its own rhythm, slower, steadier, anchored by memory. The chair opposite his desk still carried the indentation where his wife Claire used to sit sometimes, with a novel in her lap, sometimes only watching him write. Her absence was not silence, it was a presence that lived in every page, in every shadow that stretched across the floor at dusk. His son's voice on the phone had cracked the stillness. Daniel spoke quickly, almost breathless, announcing the engagement as though it were a victory rather than a decision. Pride was Thomas's first reflex. He had raised his boy to be ambitious, to chase his own story. But unease followed close behind a shadow in the light. 6 months was too little. Love was fire, yes, but marriage was stone, and stone required time to set. Thomas set the phone down and stared at the study walls. He remembered Claire's voice the first time she told him in her gentle French accent that rushing was for fools, that the best wines came from patience. He closed his eyes and could almost hear her laughter when she teased him about proposing too quickly back in Paris in 1978. The world had been different then, slower, perhaps kinder. He pressed his palm against the grain of the desk, grounding himself in its solidity. Daniel had been distant in recent years, consumed by his career in finance, carving a name in skyscrapers and boardrooms, rather than in family dinners. Thomas had watched from afar, respecting the independence but quietly aching at the space that had grown between father and son. When the call came, he wanted to believe it was a bridge being built, but the words, "she's French," echoed with a cruel irony. His son didn't know that language could carry poison as easily as it carried poetry. That evening, Thomas sat by the fireplace, a glass of bourbon in his hand. The flames' twisted shadows clawed at the walls, and he wondered who Sophie Laurent really was. Daniel had described her as radiant, educated, a woman who brought life back into his tired soul. But Thomas had taught history too long to ignore patterns, and patterns in people were as telling as those in wars. Beauty and charm often disguised ambition. He turned the glass slowly, watching the amber liquid catch the light, and felt the stirrings of caution settle into resolve. The next morning he walked the 2 miles along Commonwealth Avenue, the fall air sharp against his skin, the trees shedding their leaves in a golden rain that carpeted the sidewalks. He stopped at the old cafe where he and Claire had once debated literature and politics. Now he sat alone, the weight of memory pressing against the silence. He ordered black coffee and unfolded the newspaper, but the words blurred. All he could see was Daniel's smile, so trusting, so certain, and the shadow of a woman he had yet to meet standing just behind him. Thomas returned home and went to the attic. The air was musty, filled with the scent of cedar chests and forgotten linens. He opened a trunk Claire had once guarded like a dragon its hoard. Inside lay the remnants of their years together, photographs in Paris, letters written in her flowing French script, and journals filled with her musings. He lingered on one page where she had written, "A man's greatest test is not his own ambition but the women he allows into his son's heart." He traced the ink with his finger and felt the warning in her words like a whisper from beyond. Days passed and Boston carried on with its usual rhythm. Students rushed through the university grounds. The Charles River glittered under the afternoon sun. Yet in Thomas's study the world narrowed. He began to research Sophie in the only way a historian knew how, by gathering fragments, piecing together patterns. Public record social media traces whispers in digital corners that spoke of debts, of sudden moves, of stories too neat to be true. The portrait was not yet complete, but the outlines disturbed him. When Daniel called again to invite him to dinner with Sophie and her parents, Thomas accepted without hesitation. His voice was calm, almost warm, but inside him something coiled tighter. The dinner would not just be a meeting. It would be an interrogation masked as courtesy, a battlefield disguised with wine glasses and polite smiles. That night, unable to sleep, Thomas wandered through the house. His footsteps echoed on wooden floors that had known decades of family laughter and grief. He paused at Claire's old piano, running his fingers lightly across the keys. A few notes drifted into the air, brittle and incomplete. He sat down, closed his eyes, and imagined her beside him. He whispered into the silence, "If you were here, you'd see through her." The room answered with only the faint ticking of the clock, steady, relentless, like the heartbeat of fate. The engagement should have been a cause for joy, yet it settled over him like a storm cloud. He saw Daniel's future stretching out: boardrooms, investments, homes filled with things, but not memories. And at the center of it, a woman whose smile did not reach her eyes. He remembered the countless students who had once sat before him wide-eyed, ready to believe the narratives of history, only to learn that beneath every golden age lay betrayal and ambition. He wondered if Daniel was about to learn that lesson not in books, but in blood. By the time the dinner approached, Thomas was ready. He had not spoken his doubts aloud, not even in whispers, but the resolve had hardened in him like steel cooled in fire. He would watch, he would listen, and he would wait for the mask to slip. And when it did, he would be ready to strike, not with anger, but with the precision of a man who had spent his life studying the rise and fall of empires. The night of the dinner, he stood before the mirror adjusting his tie. His reflection showed a man older, lined with grief, but his eyes carried the fire of someone who had not yet surrendered. He thought of Claire again, of the life they had built, of the lessons they had carved into their son's soul. He picked up her photograph from the dresser, kissed the glass lightly, and whispered, "For you." Downstairs, the doorbell rang, echoing through the empty halls. Thomas took one last breath of the house's silence before opening the door. On the threshold stood Daniel, radiant and unknowing, with Sophie on his arm, her smile sharp as glass under the porch light. Behind them loomed her parents, polished, rehearsed, carrying themselves with the assurance of people who thought they had already won. Thomas stepped aside, his face calm, his voice even. "Welcome," he said, though the word felt heavy on his tongue. They entered, laughter spilling into the house, but in his mind the study's walls closed in the books, whispering like witnesses. He followed them into the dining room, where the table was set with candles and crystal glasses. As he poured the wine, his eyes caught Sophie's for a brief moment. She looked at him with a flicker of something: dismissal, perhaps, or calculation. It was enough. The trap had not yet been sprung, but the first stone had already shifted. And Thomas, the quiet professor, the grieving husband, the cautious father, knew that history was about to repeat itself in his own home. What Sophie did not yet understand was that every empire that rose on deception eventually collapsed, and Thomas Miller was ready to write the final chapter himself. Daniel's voice carried a kind of triumph Thomas hadn't heard since his son's first promotion on Wall Street. It rang through the phone like a fanfare, eager, unstoppable, and just a touch desperate. He had proposed, he said, to Sophie Laurent, a woman he'd known only half a year. 35 years of wisdom pressed down on Thomas in that moment, whispering that storms rarely announce themselves until you're already soaked to the bone. He congratulated his son, voice even steady, but his hand on the receiver tightened until his knuckles showed white. Daniel's words spilled in torrents, details about the proposal, about her laughter, about the way she had said yes before he had finished asking. Thomas listened, heart aching. He recognized that sound in his son's voice, the urgency of a man who believed love could heal the loneliness of success. Yet beneath it lay something hollow, something Thomas knew too well from his years lecturing on history, the kind of rush that built empires too quickly and left them crumbling just as fast. After the call, Thomas sat motionless in his study. The silence pressed harder than usual, thick with Claire's absence. She would have known what to say. She would have tempered Daniel's fire with calm wisdom, her French lilt carrying warnings that never sounded like warnings at all. He stared at her photograph on the mantel, her eyes laughing back at him, and wondered if she would have seen through Sophie Laurent in a single glance. The next day, Daniel came to visit. He entered the house with a whirlwind of energy, the same boy who once burst into the study to announce his school awards, only now carrying a diamond ring glinting on Sophie's finger. Sophie stood beside him, tall, poised, her smile dazzling, but oddly rehearsed. Her handshake was delicate, practiced, and her eyes skimmed over the house with the cool assessment of someone inspecting property rather than memory. She praised the architecture, the hardwood floors, the way the light fell through the windows, but not once did she ask about Claire, whose touch lingered in every corner. Thomas observed with the quiet intensity of a man used to reading between lines. Sophie's French accent was flawless, almost musical, and Daniel seemed enchanted every time she spoke. But Thomas noticed the small things, the quick glance she gave his son when the conversation veered toward money, the slight impatience when Daniel reminisced about childhood, the subtle shift in her posture when she thought no one was watching. It was the posture of someone playing a role waiting for the next cue. They stayed for dinner. Thomas prepared roast chicken, a dish Claire had perfected, filling the house with the smell of rosemary and lemon. Daniel talked endlessly, eyes glowing with love, but Sophie spoke little, sipping her wine, letting Daniel carry the conversation as though he were auditioning for her approval. When she did speak, she asked polite questions about Thomas's retirement, about his years as a professor, but her eyes betrayed disinterest. She wasn't listening. She was calculating. After they left, the house sank into silence again. Thomas cleared the dishes slowly, placing each plate back with precision, as if control over china and silverware could balance the unease gnawing at him. He poured himself bourbon and stared out the window. The street was quiet, the autumn wind stirring the leaves. He remembered how quickly 6 months had passed. 6 months was nothing. He had books in his study older than Sophie Laurent's entire relationship with his son. Days turned into weeks. Wedding plans surfaced. Daniel sent photos of venues of Sophie's family estate in Lyon, of the expensive dress she had chosen. Each image felt like a step deeper into a labyrinth with no exit. Thomas responded with restrained warmth, careful not to push too hard, careful not to fracture what remained of his bond with Daniel. Yet inside, the unease grew claws. He sought advice in the only way he knew, through books. He pulled down volumes on human behavior, reread passages he had once assigned to students about power manipulation and ambition hidden behind charm. He found himself pacing the study at night, whispers of Claire's warnings drifting back to him. He wondered if Sophie's beauty was simply the modern disguise for something far older, hunger. Then came the dinner invitation with Sophie's parents. Daniel's tone brimmed with excitement, eager for his father's approval. Thomas accepted, his voice calm, but his mind already sharpening. He knew dinner would not be a celebration, it would be a crucible. He would watch them weigh every word, test their masks. Years of dissecting historical lies had prepared him for this. The night before the dinner, he sat by the fireplace, the flames throwing shadows across the walls. He thought of Daniel as a boy sitting cross-legged on the rug, asking endless questions about ancient battles. Back then, Thomas had been the general, the strategist, the protector. Now he was older, wearier, but no less determined. He swore silently to Claire's memory that he would not let their son be devoured by ambition dressed as love. When the day came, he ironed his shirt with meticulous care, adjusted his tie until the knot was perfect. He studied his reflection. The lines on his face told of grief, of wisdom, of years spent watching history repeat itself in different disguises. He was ready. At the restaurant, the Laurent family arrived with the confidence of aristocrats. Sophie glowed beside Daniel, her hand looped through his arm, her parents radiating polish and poise. They greeted Thomas warmly, too warmly. Their charm poured on like syrup. But Thomas's eyes were sharp, unyielding. He caught the flicker in Sophie's gaze when she spoke of Daniel's future, the way her father lingered on questions about assets, the way her mother's smile tightened when Thomas remained silent. The meal unfolded like a play. Laughter echoed, glasses clinked, but beneath the surface currents swirled. When conversation slipped into French, Thomas kept his face blank, though he understood every syllable. Their words were casual, coated in silk, but threads of calculation wove through them. They spoke of Daniel as though he were a prize, a door to opportunity, a path to wealth. Thomas chewed slowly, his expression calm, but inside his mind sharpened like a blade being drawn from its sheath. He was not just a father watching his son in love. He was a man preparing for war. And what none of them knew, what Sophie herself had yet to realize, was that every trap requires time to spring, and Thomas Miller had mastered the art of patience. The night ended with smiles and farewells, Daniel radiant, Sophie's parents gracious. But when the door closed behind them, Thomas stood in the quiet of his home, his jaw tight, his eyes cold. The game had begun, and the next move would not belong to Sophie. The call began with Daniel's eager smile filling the screen, his arm looped protectively around Sophie's waist. She leaned into him with a grace that seemed rehearsed, her features striking under the soft glow of the apartment light. The camera shifted, and there they were, Mark and Isabelle Laurent, seated with the practiced poise of people used to being observed. They looked polished, their accents rich with cultivated elegance, their words dripping with tales of vineyards stretching across rolling French hills and aristocratic bloodlines that had supposedly weathered centuries. Thomas sat back in his leather chair, hands folded neatly in his lap, his eyes narrowing only slightly. He had taught enough history to know that truth did not need embellishment. Truth carried itself without glitter. But here every detail shimmered too brightly. Every anecdote was a touch too polished, the cadence of their voices just a beat off from sincerity. Mark spoke of a great-grandfather who was a baron, but his dates collided with wars Thomas knew too well. Isabelle smiled proudly as she mentioned estates in Provence, though her accent betrayed a Parisian origin she never claimed. The inconsistencies whispered like cracks beneath a coat of paint, invisible to Daniel's love-struck gaze but glaring to Thomas's trained eye. Sophie, for her part, was dazzling. She laughed at the right moments, her hand brushing Daniel's arm, her gaze flicking to the camera as if to charm not just father and son, but the very lens itself. Her beauty was undeniable, yet her charm was like silk stretched too thin, translucent under pressure. When Daniel spoke of his career of the firm he had built from the ground up, Sophie's smile faltered for half a second, her eyes darting quickly to her parents. It was a slip most would miss, but Thomas caught at a flicker that told a different story. Interest not in the man, but in what the man owned. The Lawrence filled the conversation with warmth, but it was the kind of warmth that pressed too close, the kind that demanded admiration rather than invited it. They spoke of tradition, of legacy, of family values, but when Daniel mentioned Boston winters or the long hours he spent building his business, their smiles stiffened. Thomas recognized that smile. It was the same one politicians wore when trapped in a question they hadn't prepared for. He kept his responses measured, his tone polite. He asked about their vineyard, about the soil, the harvest, the market details a true vintner would relish. Mark's answers drifted into vague generalities, his charm faltering under the weight of specifics. Isabelle quickly steered the subject elsewhere, to travel, to art, to the importance of family unity. Daniel nodded enthusiastically, oblivious to the diversion, but Thomas noted it with the precision of a man cataloging evidence. When the call ended, Daniel was radiant, brimming with excitement, declaring how wonderful it was that both sides had connected so smoothly. He saw a future unfolding effortlessly, a union not just of hearts, but of families. Thomas closed his laptop slowly, the screen fading to black as his own reflection appeared in the glass. He studied his face, the lines carved by years of teaching, by grief, by the relentless passage of time. Behind his own eyes lingered the memory of Claire, her voice warning him of facades dressed as fairy tales. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the radiator. Thomas leaned back in his chair and exhaled, his breath heavy in the stillness. He poured a drink bourbon neat and let it rest on his desk, untouched. He thought of how charm often disguised intent, how civilizations had fallen not to swords, but to whispers behind closed doors, to alliances forged in deceit. He wondered if Daniel was walking blind into such a story, and if so, what role he himself was destined to play. That night, Thomas lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the shadows forming strange shapes in the corners of the room. His mind replayed the call in fragments: Mark's forced laugh, Isabel's rehearsed grace, Sophie's fleeting glance toward the fortune her fiancé represented. He turned the images over like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Claire's face, her expression sharp with the kind of wisdom he had always trusted. He whispered into the darkness, "What would you see that I cannot sleep?" Came late and shallow, but with dawn came resolve. He would not confront Daniel outright, not yet. To accuse without proof was to risk losing his son entirely. Instead, he would watch. He would listen. He would gather. Years of study had taught him patience, and patience would be his weapon now. In the days that followed, Thomas began to notice the small shifts in Daniel's life. Calls became shorter, more rushed. Meetings with Sophie and her family consumed weekends. Daniel's laughter carried a new edge, a kind of urgency that unsettled Thomas. He watched from a distance, careful not to press too hard, yet every moment deepened his unease. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the city in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas sat once again in his study. He opened a journal Claire had kept during their years together. On one page, written in her graceful hand, were the words, "Love is tested not in what is promised, but in what is revealed when no one is watching." He closed the book slowly, his chest tightening with both grief and certainty. The Lawrence had revealed more than they intended in that call. And Thomas, the quiet observer, the grieving husband, the wary father, knew the facade would crack further. He would be there when it did. What none of them yet realized was that history has a way of repeating itself, and Thomas Miller was already preparing to write the next chapter. Le Jardin glowed with the kind of light that could make even silence feel expensive. The chandeliers shimmered above linen-draped tables, the air steeped in butter garlic, and the low hum of a pianist weaving through familiar French standards. For most, it was simply a fine restaurant tucked on a quiet Boston street. For Thomas, it was sacred ground. This was where Claire once laughed so hard she knocked over a glass of Bordeaux, where he had reached across the table on their 10th anniversary and told her without hesitation that he would choose her again in every lifetime. Tonight he had returned without her, but not without purpose. Tonight the air carried both memory and challenge. He arrived early, his suit pressed, his tie perfectly knotted. The maitre d', man who remembered Thomas from years past, greeted him with warmth but caught the edge of steel in his eyes. Thomas requested the corner table near the tall windows, the one that had always been his and Claire's. He sat with his back to the wall, the way he once told his students generals did in wartime, to see the battlefield unfold. The battlefield tonight was disguised as polished silverware and soft candlelight. He let his fingers trace the rim of the glass before him, recalling the exact tone of Claire's laugh, the shape of her hand on his. For a moment grief threatened to unravel him, but he pulled it back, locking it into place, converting it into resolve. She was gone, but her wisdom remained, and her presence was here in every detail of this room. He would honor her by seeing clearly what his son could not. When Daniel and Sophie entered, followed closely by Mark and Isabel, the restaurant seemed to lean toward them. Sophie's dress shimmered under the lights, a calculated choice Thomas thought elegance designed to disarm. Mark exuded practiced charm, Isabel a poise sharp enough to cut. Daniel looked flushed with pride, eager to parade them into this sanctuary, as though merging two worlds was a cause for celebration. He could not see the lines of theater written across their faces. Thomas rose slowly, greeting each with a handshake that lingered just long enough to remind them he was not a man easily swayed. His eyes held theirs, searching for the slips, the cracks beneath the polish. Sophie kissed his cheek lightly, her perfume sweet and cloying, but Thomas detected the faintest tremor in her smile, as though she was still rehearsing her role. The waiter poured wine. Thomas chose the vintage carefully, a Bordeaux from the year he and Claire had once toasted their 25th anniversary. It wasn't nostalgia. It was strategy. He watched as Mark swirled the glass with exaggerated knowledge, nodding approval, but mispronouncing the vineyard's name in a way that sliced through the illusion of sophistication. Isabel corrected him gently, but Thomas caught the irritation in her eyes. Conversation began with pleasantries. Daniel spoke about his latest project. Sophie praised the city. Mark extolled the beauty of their vineyard in autumn. Isabel recounted stories of old family traditions. It was all smooth, polished, almost too much so. Thomas let them talk, interjecting only with quiet, pointed questions, details about soil types in Bordeaux, about the history of Mark's supposed noble lineage, about the economics of exporting wine. Each question tightened the air slightly. Answers grew vaguer, smiles stiffer, the sheen of confidence thinning with each exchange. Sophie filled the spaces with charm, her hand occasionally resting on Daniel's arm, her laughter timed perfectly to his jokes. Yet Thomas watched her eyes, sharp and restless, darting like a predator assessing the terrain. When Daniel mentioned the success of his firm, she leaned forward almost imperceptibly, her parents' expressions brightening just a fraction too much. They cloaked it in affection, but Thomas read it for what it was: calculation. The food arrived, plates of duck confit and coq au vin steam curling into the candlelight. To Daniel, it was celebration. To Thomas, it was communion. Every bite was a reminder of Claire. Every flavor a whisper of the life they had built with honesty and struggle. Across from him, Sophie and her parents devoured with elegance but without reverence. They tasted the meal but not the meaning. They would never understand that this table was not just a table, but an altar to truth. As the evening unfolded, Thomas remained calm, his demeanor unwavering. He spoke in measured tones, smiled politely, and allowed the conversation to flow. But beneath his composure, he was dissecting every word, cataloging every inconsistency. When Mark claimed his family had ties to French nobility dating back to the Revolution, Thomas's mind supplied the history. Instantly, titles abolished, records destroyed, claims like his, born more often from fantasy than fact. When Isabel spoke of their vineyard, producing award-winning wines, Thomas noted the absence of specific competitions of verifiable detail. Lies always faltered under scrutiny, and these were no different. Yet what struck him most was Daniel's blindness. His son's gaze remained fixed on Sophie, adoration radiating so strongly it drowned out reason. He saw her as salvation, as proof that love could rewrite loneliness. And Sophie let him believe it, her every gesture feeding the illusion. By dessert, the performance was complete. Mark and Isabel leaned back with practiced ease. Sophie rested her hand lightly on Daniel's, and Daniel beamed as though the future stretched before him like an open road. But Thomas saw it differently. He saw fault lines spreading across the polished surface, fractures that would widen with time. And he knew that if he did not act, those fractures would swallow his son whole. When the bill arrived, Thomas reached for it without hesitation. He signed his name with a steady hand, each stroke a vow. Tonight had been a test, and they had failed it. But he would not reveal his hand, not yet. War was never won in a single battle. It was patient strategy, the careful placement of every move. As they parted ways outside the restaurant, the night air crisp against his face, Thomas watched Sophie's hand slip through Daniel's arm. Her smile glimmered under the streetlight, but Thomas saw the shadow behind it. Mark and Isabel whispered to each other, their voices low but urgent. Daniel, oblivious, kissed his father on the cheek and thanked him for the evening. Thomas stood alone on the sidewalk, the glow of Le Jardin fading behind him. The city's hum surrounded him, but his mind was elsewhere, already racing ahead. Tonight had been sacred, a battlefield dressed as dinner. He had seen what he needed to see. The mask had slipped, if only for a moment, and that was enough. He turned toward the darkness, his steps measured, his face carved in resolve. This was no longer about suspicion. It was about protection. And Thomas Miller knew that the next move would not be taken at a dinner table but in a place where facades could not survive. The stage was set, and the true test was yet to come. The candles on the table burned lower, their wax pooling into shadows that stretched across white linen. Daniel's laughter filled the air, warm and oblivious, as he recounted a story from college. His glass raised his smile, boyish and proud. Sophie sat beside him, her hand grazing his sleeve with the precision of a performer hitting her mark. Mark nodded politely. Isabel offered her soft chuckles, and to anyone watching, it was the portrait of harmony. But beneath the polished surface, the rot revealed itself in whispers. Thomas's eyes caught the smallest flicker of movement. Sophie leaning toward her mother, her voice dipping low, her smile curving into something sharper. She spoke in French, the words smooth, deliberate, sliding under the hum of Daniel's laughter. Un vieux bœuf ennuyeux, she said, her tone almost playful. A boring old cow. Her mother's lips twitched with amusement. Thomas felt the words pierce through the air and into his chest, the insult landing not with shock, but with confirmation. He kept his face steady, his hand unmoving on the stem of his glass, as if he had not understood. But he had. Every syllable. Sophie continued, her voice gaining the confidence of someone certain she was unheard. She called Daniel her billet d'or, her golden ticket, and then with clinical cruelty laid out her plan. She would marry quickly, secure her position, then bide her time until divorce would deliver her half of his fortune. She spoke of it casually, as though discussing vacation plans, her words dripping with contempt. Isabel listened with the detachment of a woman who had rehearsed this scheme long before. Thomas's chest tightened, not with surprise, but with something colder. Rage surged through him like fire in a locked chamber, but he did not let it escape. His late wife's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him that silence could be sharper than fury, that patience was the blade hidden behind the smile. He glanced at Daniel, still laughing, still blind, the boy he had raised now, seated at the edge of ruin without knowing it. His heart cracked, grief mixing with fury, but his face betrayed nothing. The waiter approached with the next course, steam curling from plates of seared lamb and truffle potatoes. Thomas thanked him softly, his voice calm, his tone measured. Sophie leaned back, her smile wide and innocent, as though she had not just committed treason in plain sight. She lifted her glass to Daniel's, their eyes meeting in a performance of affection. Daniel clinked his glass against hers, lost in the glow of love he believed was real. Thomas chewed slowly, every bite tasting of ash, his mind replaying her words. He thought of Claire, of the years they had built brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, love stitched into every corner of their life together. And now, a woman with painted nails and rehearsed charm planned to gut it all in the span of a few calculated years. He wanted to rise, to slam his fist against the table, to tear the mask from her face in front of everyone. But he didn't. He knew better. History had taught him that wars were not won in moments of passion, but in the quiet hours where strategy took root. He set his fork down and reached for his wine, the liquid dark and rich. He drank slowly, watching Sophie laugh at something Daniel whispered in her ear. To anyone else it was the image of a couple in love. To Thomas it was the sight of a predator tightening its grip on prey. His heart ached, but he steadied it with resolve. The Lawrence believed they had delivered their lines in secrecy, but their stage had no curtain. He had seen the truth, and truth once revealed was impossible to bury again. The rest of the dinner blurred into a haze of small talk and clinking glasses. Thomas nodded, offered polite responses, asked questions that meant nothing. All the while the storm inside him gathered weight. He caught Sophie's eyes once, just for a heartbeat. Her gaze was smug, her confidence unshaken. She believed him oblivious, the fool at the edge of his son's new world. She would regret that belief. When the plates were cleared and the dessert served, Thomas excused himself for a moment, stepping into the hallway lined with framed photographs of Le Jardin's history. He stared at one black and white image of the restaurant in 1947, A family gathered around a table unaware of the decades to come. He breathed deeply, steadying the tempest in his chest. This place, once a sanctuary with Claire, had become the crucible where betrayal was exposed. He felt her presence beside him, not gentle this time, but firm, urging him to fight with the wisdom she had left him. Returning to the table, he slid back into his chair, his expression composed. Sophie smiled at him sweetly, unaware that the balance of power had already shifted. Her words had armed him, had turned suspicion into certainty and certainty into resolve. He no longer questioned her motives. He knew them. He no longer feared losing his son to illusion. He prepared instead to shatter it with undeniable truth. The evening ended with the exchange of pleasantries, with promises of future dinners, with Daniel glowing beside the woman he thought was his future. Outside, the night was crisp, the city alive with passing cars and the faint echo of laughter from nearby bars. Thomas shook Mark's hand, kissed Isabel's cheek, and allowed Sophie's air kiss to brush against him. He watched as Daniel led them to the car, his pride blinding him still. When the taillights disappeared into the distance, Thomas remained on the sidewalk, the night air sharp against his face. He stood there for a long time, his mind cold and clear. He thought of Claire's journals, of the lessons he had taught his students about empires built on deceit. He thought of Sophie's words, venom wrapped in French silk, and knew she had written her own downfall. He turned back toward the restaurant, its warm glow now behind him, and began to walk. His steps were steady, his shoulders squared. Inside, grief churned with rage. But above them both sat a steady flame of purpose. He would not confront her tonight. That would be too easy, too merciful. No, he would dismantle her carefully, piece by piece, until every mask she wore shattered in front of the son she sought to ruin. And as he walked into the shadows of the Boston night, Thomas Miller carried with him not just heartbreak, but the cold resolve of a man who had listened, understood, and chosen silence, not as surrender, but as the sharpest weapon of all. The stage had been set, the roles defined, and the next act would not be played on Sophie's terms. Thomas's hand was steady as he passed the salt, his expression carved into polite composure, but every muscle in his body coiled like steel wire. Sophie thanked him sweetly, unaware that he had already heard her venom, that he had translated every whispered word she thought secret. Daniel leaned back in his chair, still glowing with love, oblivious to the predator at his side. Thomas lifted his glass, nodded at Mark's shallow toast, and let the fire burn inside him unseen. This was not the moment for rage. Rage was loud, reckless, and fleeting. What Sophie deserved was something colder, deliberate, permanent. He smiled at the right times, murmured approval when Daniel bragged about the firm's recent expansion, endured Isabel's rehearsed admiration for the restaurant. They thought they had fooled him, that the performance was flawless. But Thomas was no ordinary audience. He had spent his life studying empires that collapsed under the weight of their own arrogance. He knew that masks always slipped, that lies left trails, and he had just been handed the map. The evening wore on until the final course, when Sophie leaned into Daniel, her laughter honeyed, her touch delicate. Thomas's chest tightened at the sight. It wasn't jealousy, it wasn't grief, it was a father's fury, tempered into resolve. Daniel was blind, but Thomas would not be. He let them leave the table, believing the night had ended on their terms, walked them out with the same courteous dignity Claire once praised in him, and bid his son good night. Only when he was alone did he let the mask drop. In the silence of his home, he stood by the study window, the city lights shimmering against the glass. His reflection stared back, older now, wearied by loss, but his eyes burned sharp as ever. He poured a bourbon, sat at his desk, and opened one of Claire's old journals. The words on the page reminded him of battles fought in silence, of victories won not by brute force but by strategy. He closed the book slowly, almost reverently, and began to draft his plan. The next morning, Thomas made his first call. David Chen, an old friend from his teaching days, now one of the most respected immigration lawyers in New York, answered on the second ring. Their conversation was brief, measured, but it ended with a promise. Documents could be obtained, records uncovered, backgrounds examined. Nothing Sophie or her family had presented was beyond scrutiny, and scrutiny was exactly what Thomas intended. Over the next weeks, he balanced his public composure with private investigation. He continued to meet Daniel for lunches, to listen to his son's excitement about wedding plans, to nod with encouragement. He never once hinted at what he knew. Every time Daniel looked at him with gratitude for his support. Thomas swallowed the ache in his chest. Silence was not weakness, it was armor. Each smile he offered Sophie was a sharpened blade hidden in plain sight. The trail of deceit began to emerge. Credit reports with unpaid debts buried beneath layers of overseas accounts. A broken engagement in Paris hushed up with money. Lawsuits dismissed quietly in Lyon records that smelled of bribery. Mark's vineyard, once painted as an empire, was revealed to be failing, its land mortgaged beyond saving. Isabel's tales of tradition unraveled into a history of financial collapse dressed in silk. Thomas cataloged everything page by page, file by file, until his desk became a war table. He highlighted inconsistencies, cross-referenced dates, drew connections with the precision of a historian mapping the fall of a dynasty. And as the evidence mounted, his resolve only hardened. But he did not confront Daniel. Not yet. To storm in with accusations would only drive his son closer to Sophie. No, the blow had to be undeniable, delivered in such a way that even Daniel's heart could not excuse it. Thomas knew that truth alone was never enough. It had to be staged, revealed, at the moment when the audience could no longer look away. At night, he walked the empty rooms of his house, the shadows long and familiar. He thought of Claire, of the steadiness she brought, of the way she once told him that real strength was not in speaking first, but in speaking last. He whispered into the stillness, promising her that he would not fail their son. Not now, not when he was teetering on the edge of ruin. Daniel continued to glow in Sophie's presence, continued to mistake her calculated charm for devotion. Thomas watched from the sidelines, masking his disgust with polite nods. Each time he shook Mark's hand, each time Isabel kissed his cheek, he reminded himself that the predator who smiled could be just as dangerous as the predator who struck. But he also knew which one history remembered. The day would come when the mask would tear, when Sophie's performance would collapse under the weight of her own arrogance. And Thomas would be there, not shouting, not pleading, but delivering the kind of blow that left no room for denial. He had patience. He had knowledge. And now he had proof. As he sat one evening at his desk, papers spread before him like battle plans, the phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. It was a photo, him and Sophie beaming, holding hands, a caption about love and forever. Thomas stared at the image, his heart tightening, but then he leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. The trap was set, the pieces in motion. What Sophie did not yet understand was that she had already lost the moment she underestimated him. And Thomas Miller, calm on the surface but burning beneath, was prepared to wait as long as it took for the perfect moment to strike. The war had begun, and the battlefield belonged to him. Thomas had always believed that information was the sharpest weapon a man could wield, and now it became the core of his war. Days after the dinner at Le Jardin, he took the train to New York. The gray November sky mirrored in the glass as the city rushed by. He traveled light, carrying only a worn leather briefcase and a mindset like iron. At Penn Station, the crowds pressed around him, but his focus was fixed. He was on his way to see David Chen, a man he trusted not just with legal complexities, but with truth itself. David had been a quiet force back in their college days, the kind of man who rarely raised his voice but always won debates. Now he was one of the most respected immigration lawyers in the country, a figure whose calm presence belied his ability to dismantle lives with documents and signatures. When Thomas entered his sleek Manhattan office lined with glass walls and shelves of heavy law books, David rose with the same thoughtful smile Thomas remembered. They shook hands, and in that handshake was the unspoken acknowledgement of what lay ahead. Thomas laid it out carefully, his words precise, his tone controlled. He told David about Sophie Laurent, about Mark and Isabel, about the dinner that had revealed too much. He didn't embellish, didn't let fury color his account. He spoke like a historian presenting evidence, though this time the stakes were not empires long dead, but the life of his only son. David listened without interruption, only nodding when Thomas mentioned the whispered plan in French, the cruelty hidden behind Sophie's smile. When Thomas finished, David leaned back, his expression grave but resolute. "If what you suspect is true," he said, "there will be records. Paper always leaves a trail, no matter how carefully hidden. And in my world, paper speaks louder than charm." The investigation began quietly, meticulously. David had contacts, people who owed him favors, people who knew how to peel back layers of polished lies. Within days, fragments began to emerge. A vineyard drowning in debt, parcels of land, mortgaged beyond their value, lawsuits that had been buried under settlements. The Laurent family's facade of wealth was nothing more than glass, stretched thin over rot. Thomas sat across from David as each file was laid on the table. He studied the documents with the cold patience of a man who had once taught students to examine sources, to question narratives, to trace motives through evidence. Here, it was undeniable black ink on white paper. Mark and Isabel were not guardians of tradition. They were drowning, clawing for air, and Sophie was their weapon. But the documents went deeper. David uncovered whispers of a broken engagement in Paris, a man whose family had paid handsomely to silence scandal. The details were vague, sealed in confidentiality, but enough remained to sketch the outline of a woman who had rehearsed this role before. And then came the messages. Extracted from a phone account left unsecured, they revealed Sophie's contempt in her own words. ATM, she had written about Daniel. Stupidly generous. Easy. Each line was acid on the page, searing through Thomas's restraint. He felt the old rage surge again, but this time it cooled into something harder, sharper. He didn't slam the table, didn't curse her name. He only nodded slowly, his lips pressed into a thin line. Every piece of evidence was a brick, and brick by brick he was building the wall that would collapse on Sophie Laurent. At night, Thomas returned to Boston with folders tucked carefully into his briefcase. He spread them across his study like maps of an enemy territory. The lamplight cast shadows on the pages, highlighting debts, false titles, messages dripping with cruelty. He read each one as if memorizing a script, preparing for a confrontation that would be more than personal. It would be decisive, final. Daniel continued to call, his voice filled with excitement about wedding preparations. Thomas listened, his tone warm, offering advice on venues, nodding when Daniel spoke of tuxedos and vows. But when the call ended, he returned to the documents, his expression grim. He was no longer simply a father. He was the architect of a reckoning. David checked in, often updating him on new findings, refining the case. Immigration laws, financial regulations, patterns of fraud, all began to align into a narrative that Sophie could not escape. There would be no room for her to spin lies, no angle from which she could charm her way free. When the hammer fell, it would fall with the weight of truth, unyielding and absolute. One evening, as the snow began to drift against the windows, Thomas sat in his study, staring at a single photograph of Claire. Her smile was calm, her eyes knowing, as if she had always seen the battles he would one day face. He whispered to her, not in grief this time, but in resolve. "I have the proof now. She won't take him. Not while I breathe." The fire in the hearth crackled its warmth, brushing against his face, but inside him was something colder, something steadier. The pieces were in place, the weapons gathered. What remained was timing. Thomas knew that history remembered not only the victors, but the precision with which they struck. He would not rush, he would not falter. He would wait for the moment when Sophie's mask was most secure, when Daniel's blindness was deepest. And then in one move he would rip it all away. The night stretched long, the city outside muffled in snow. But Thomas sat unmoving, his eyes fixed on the evidence before him. He was no longer the grieving husband, no longer just the cautious father. He was a man who had unearthed the truth and was prepared to wield it. And as the clock struck midnight, Thomas Miller closed the last folder with a click that echoed like the shutting of a cell door. The case was built. The stage was set. All that remained was the reveal, and when it came, Sophie Laurent would discover that the quiet professor she had mocked was the one enemy she could never defeat. The Avalon Club was a palace of glass and marble, its chandeliers dripping with light that made the crowd shimmer like a constellation. Laughter echoed against vaulted ceilings, champagne flutes clinked in manicured hands, and every corner smelled of wealth and victory. Daniel stood at the center of it all, radiant, one hand resting proudly on Sophie's back as if she were already his queen. His business partners circled with congratulations, their wives whispering about the dazzling French fiancée and her pedigree. To the untrained eye, it was a celebration without flaw, but Thomas knew better. To him, this was not a party. It was a stage, and tonight the curtain would finally rise. He had arrived in silence, dressed in a dark suit that sharpened his lean frame, carrying nothing but the weight of truth. David Chen followed at his side, his expression unreadable, his briefcase locked with the precision of a man who carried futures inside. The air shifted when Thomas entered, though no one noticed it yet. He moved through the crowd like a shadow, exchanging polite nods, his eyes always returning to Sophie. She glowed with confidence, her laughter ringing like crystal, her charm sweeping through the room with practiced ease. She believed the night belonged to her. Dinner was served, and the hum of conversation swelled around the long banquet tables. Speeches began, shallow words about love, about legacy, about the merging of families. Daniel's closest partner toasted to success and fortune. Sophie's father praised tradition. Her mother dabbed her eyes with a linen napkin at the perfection of it all. Every sentence was rehearsed, every smile painted. Then it was Thomas's turn. He rose slowly, the scrape of his chair slicing through the music, and the room hushed with instinctive deference. He stood tall, his glass steady in his hand, and began to speak. His voice was deep, calm, resonant. He started in English, thanking the guests for honoring his son, acknowledging the glow of the evening, even pausing to smile toward Daniel. The room relaxed, but then without warning his tone shifted. The words slipped into flawless French, each syllable precise, his accent undeniable. At first there was surprise, then admiration. But admiration turned to stillness as the sentences sharpened. Thomas repeated what Sophie had whispered to her mother that night at Le Jardin, word for word. He called himself the boring old cow. He spoke of Daniel as her golden ticket. He delivered it all in French so pure it cut through the air like glass. Gasps rippled across the room. Heads turned, whispers darted like sparks in dry grass. Sophie froze her face, draining of color, her smile cracking at the edges. The silence after his words was absolute. Thomas let it breathe, let it strangle the illusion, then nodded toward David Chen. The lawyer rose with the calm authority of a judge pronouncing sentence. He opened his briefcase and with methodical precision produced the documents. One by one he laid them on the table for all to see. Debt records, mortgage defaults, lawsuits in Paris, a broken engagement hushed by money. And finally, projected on a screen behind him, Sophie's own words pulled from her texts, ATM. Stupidly generous. Easy. The room fractured. Business partners leaned back in their chairs, eyes narrowing. Whispers turned to sharp murmurs. Isabel clutched her pearls. Mark's face collapsed under the weight of exposure. Sophie tried to rise, stammering denials, but the evidence thundered louder than her protests. Her charm, once unshakable, disintegrated under the glare of truth. Daniel sat frozen, his hand still hovering where Sophie's fingers had rested moments before. His face was pale, his eyes wide, betrayal slashing through him with every word. He looked at his father, then at the screen, then at Sophie, his world cracking apart in real time. Sophie reached for him, her voice breaking, insisting it was a misunderstanding, but her own words on the screen betrayed her with merciless clarity. Thomas stood in silence, letting the storm consume her. He did not gloat, did not raise his voice. He only watched steady as stone while Sophie crumbled before everyone she had hoped to impress. Mark attempted a defense, mumbling about family misfortunes, about misunderstandings, but no one listened. Isabel dabbed her eyes, her mask of sophistication dissolving into raw panic. David closed his briefcase with a soft click that sounded final. The audience, stunned, turned their eyes back to Thomas. He raised his glass once more, his expression unreadable. "To truth," he said simply, his voice carrying across the room. "And to my son's future." He drank, and the silence swallowed the toast like a verdict. Sophie collapsed into her chair, her shoulders trembling, her mask shattered. Daniel rose abruptly, his chair clattering against the marble floor. He stared at her with a look that was not anger, not yet, but devastation so raw it cut deeper than fury ever could. He turned away without a word, his steps unsteady, his world collapsing beneath him. The guests began to disperse, whispers trailing like smoke. The engagement that had been painted as a triumph only hours earlier was now ashes, its wreckage scattered in the glittering Avalon Club. Sophie's name was ruined, her family's lies laid bare, and Daniel's business partners looked at him with pity rather than admiration. Thomas remained at the table, his expression still, his eyes distant. He had not celebrated his victory, for victory felt hollow when won at such a cost. Yet he knew it had been necessary. His son had been saved not from heartbreak, but from ruin. The evidence had spoken louder than any plea, louder than any warning. Truth had been delivered in the only language Sophie had believed was safe. As the chandeliers dimmed and the last guests slipped into the night, Thomas stood adjusting his tie with calm precision. He walked toward the exit where Daniel stood alone, his back turned, his shoulders heavy. Thomas paused, knowing the road ahead would not be simple. Betrayal left scars that time alone could not heal. But he also knew that from this night forward the mask was gone, the stage cleared, and the real work between father and son would begin. Outside, the city pulsed with life, indifferent to the storm that had just broken within the Avalon Club. Thomas stepped into the cold air, his breath sharp against the night. The battle had been fought, the truth delivered, but the war for his son's trust was only beginning. The Avalon Club's marble floors had long grown cold by the time Daniel broke. He stood outside in the night air, the echo of whispered betrayal still clawing at him, his chest rising and falling as though the world itself had caved in on his lungs. He had given Sophie everything, his trust, his heart, his future, and in a single evening it had been stripped away, her words exposed like daggers she had never intended him to see. The mask was gone, and all that remained was devastation. Thomas found him leaning against the stone pillar at the club's entrance, his shoulders hunched, his hands trembling. For a moment, Thomas simply looked at him, seeing not the successful financier nor the man of 35 years, but the boy who once scraped his knee on a Boston sidewalk and came running into Claire's arms. Slowly he placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Daniel turned, eyes red, jaw tight with grief he couldn't contain. And then he broke, falling into his father's embrace like a man drowning who had finally found shore. Thomas held him not with triumph, but with sorrow. His arms wrapped firmly around his son, anchoring him against the tide of humiliation and heartbreak. "It's not your fault," Thomas murmured, his voice low, steady, carrying the weight of decades. "Trust is a gift, Daniel, not a flaw. What she did was hers, to carry, not yours." Daniel's sobs shook through him, raw and unfiltered, as years of pride collapsed into vulnerability. And Thomas, the man Sophie had mocked as boring, stood unshaken, proving that dignity could hold a man together when everything else fell apart. The weeks that followed were quiet, but heavy. Daniel withdrew from the glitter of his business circles, declined invitations, and buried himself in work. Gossip spread about the party, about Sophie's downfall, about the Lawrence fleeing back to France with reputations in ruins. Yet the whispers could not pierce the silence that hung over Daniel's life. It was the silence of rebuilding, of learning to walk again after the ground had shattered beneath him. Thomas stayed close without pressing. He joined Daniel for dinners, sat across from him in quiet cafes, let him talk when he needed to, and sit in silence when words refused to come. Sometimes they spoke of trivial things, sports scores, weather, the chaos of Boston traffic. Other times, Daniel asked about Claire, about the way she had seen people so clearly, about how she would have handled Sophie. Each time Thomas answered with a softness that reminded Daniel he was not alone in his grief. Winter thawed into spring, and with it came a fragile kind of healing. Daniel began to laugh again, the sound tentative at first, then fuller. He no longer checked his phone for messages that would never come. He no longer wore the ring that had once promised forever. And one evening, after a long walk along the Charles River, he looked at his father and said, "You didn't just save me from her. You saved me from becoming someone blind." Thomas said nothing, only placed a hand on his shoulder, the gesture carrying more weight than any speech could. Months later, in the warmth of early summer, father and son boarded a plane to France. Daniel had asked for it. He wanted to stand where his mother rested to speak to her, not as the boy she had raised, but as the man she would never meet again. They drove through winding country roads until they reached the small cemetery tucked behind an old stone church, lavender fields stretching beyond its walls. Claire's headstone was simple, elegant, marked with words Thomas himself had chosen years before. Beloved wife, devoted mother, truth in all things. Daniel stood before it for a long time, the wind stirring gently through the grass, his silence carrying both grief and gratitude. Finally he knelt, pressing his palm against the cool stone. His voice broke when he spoke, but he did not turn away. "I thought I was strong, Mom," he said softly, "but I was blind. Dad saw what I couldn't. He carried the weight I should have, and he never let me fall." He drew a shaky breath, his tears falling freely. "I see it now. His revenge wasn't about anger. It was about love, about protecting me even when I didn't want to be protected." Thomas stood behind him, his hands folded in quiet reverence, the weight of years pressing on him. Hearing his son's words, he felt something loosen in his chest, a knot that had been tied since the moment Sophie first walked into their lives. He closed his eyes, imagining Claire's voice carried in the wind, her approval soft but certain. They lingered until the sun dipped low, casting the cemetery in golden light. Daniel rose, wiping his face, and for the first time in months his shoulders seemed lighter. He turned to his father, his expression solemn but steady. "I understand now," he said. "You didn't fight her because you hated her. You fought her because you loved me more than I could see." Thomas met his gaze, his own eyes damp, though his face remained composed. "A father's role," he said quietly, "isn't to shield his son from every wound. It's to make sure the wound doesn't kill him." They walked back to the car in silence, the lavender swaying in the evening breeze. The road ahead would not erase the scars, but it would carry them forward together. For Daniel, it was the beginning of a life rebuilt on truth rather than illusion. For Thomas, it was the bittersweet peace of knowing that his vengeance had never been about destruction, but about preservation. As the car pulled away from the cemetery, Daniel glanced out the window, the headstone growing smaller in the distance. He reached over, gripping his father's hand, a silent vow that he understood now what had always driven Thomas, not anger, not pride, but love, armed with wisdom. And as the French countryside unfurled before them, bathed in the fading light, Thomas Miller allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The battle was over, the scars would remain, but in their place grew something stronger, a bond reforged in truth, in grief, and in the kind of love that survives even betrayal. It was not victory he carried home, but something far greater, peace born of war, and a son who finally saw him clearly. Life has a way of testing us in moments we least expect, and often those tests come through the people closest to us. This story reminds us that trust is both a gift and a risk. It makes us vulnerable, but it also reveals our strength when that trust is broken. For older generations, the lesson is clear. Wisdom is not only in what we have lived through, but in how we use it to protect those we love. Thomas did not fight with rage, nor did he allow betrayal to define him. Instead, he relied on patience, truth, and the quiet strength of experience to guide his son back to safety. In our own lives, we may not face schemes as dramatic, but we will all encounter moments when we must choose whether to act with anger or with wisdom. Let us remember that protection born of love carries more power than revenge born of hate, and that the calm hand of experience can save a family from falling apart. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more powerful stories that honor wisdom, dignity, and the strength of experience.